Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, trauma and boundaries. The word boundaries is a buzzword. We have definitely talked about it in the show countless times. Boundaries are an essential part of human relationships. But there is a cost to not having healthy boundaries. Why is it so hard for many of us to set boundaries? And why don't we have healthy boundaries in the first place? Tune in as I talk to Nedra Tawwab, the New York Times bestselling author of Set Boundaries, Find Peace, on how to get better at expressing your needs, saying no, and asserting yourself without offending others. We also discuss the 6 types of boundaries, saying no without feeling guilty, boundaries as self-care, trauma and boundaries, setting boundaries without long explanations and justifications, dealing with difficult people who are boundary pushers, setting boundaries with kids and family members, and how to identify in what areas of your life you need to be more assertive in terms of boundaries. Nedra Tawwab is a licensed therapist and sought-after relationship expert. She has practiced relationship therapy for 12 years and is the founder and owner of the group therapy practice Kaleidoscope Counseling. Every day, she helps people create healthy relationships by teaching them how to implement boundaries. Her philosophy is that a lack of boundaries and assertiveness underlie most relationship issues, and her gift is helping people create healthy relationships with themselves and others. Before we get to today's wonderful conversation, here are a few past episodes about boundaries that you may enjoy. Episode 215, Transform Your Boundaries with Sari Gilman. Episode 264, Boundaries, a Roundtable. This is a fantastic episode with some of my listeners, the members of the Authentic Parenting Support Group. We got together and we did a roundtable on the topic of boundaries. This is a real conversation with real people and not experts. Episode 308, How to Ask for What You Need in a Relationship with Yvette Erasmus. She's one of my favorite guests. She has appeared several times on the podcast. And in fact, the next suggestion is also an episode with her. Episode 262, When Your Needs Are Not Met, with Yvette Erasmus. Definitely worth a listen. And lastly, an on-air coaching episode with one of the members of the Authentic Parenting community, episode 236, 3 Steps to Effective Limit Setting. There you go. You have lots to explore on the topic of boundaries. And now, please enjoy this fantastic conversation with Nedra Tawwab. Nedra, thank you so much for being here today.
You're so welcome. I'm so excited to talk.
Yeah, I want to talk about boundaries, so many things. I want to talk about boundaries and trauma, setting boundaries with ourselves, which is very, very important to my podcast, to my work. I want to talk about setting boundaries with our children. But before we get to all of the practical stuff, I think it would be good to define boundaries, even though we all have an understanding. I think people who follow you are very well versed, but maybe there is someone who's like, what is boundaries? So let's start with that.
Yeah, boundaries are our operating manual. It's our policies and procedures. It's our rules for ourselves and our relationships with other people. It is what keeps us safe and comfortable. It is not a way to control people. It is a way to have healthy relationships. It is about what you do, not necessarily about controlling what other people do.
You're right there. You just busted one myth right off the get-go, how people perceive things about boundaries.
Yes, sometimes we're like, I'm going to make them stop drinking. And it's like, whoa, that's not a boundary. You can't make them do anything, but you can certainly have some parameters around how this person is able to show up with you. And that is a really challenging piece that, sometimes we think we'll experience superior comfort when we can get everyone around us to do whatever we want them to do. And it just doesn't work in that way.
Yeah, wouldn't be that lovely. Life would be so much easier and perfect. But you identify 3 types of boundaries, and I took the test. And I want to mention to anybody who is listening that in your book, you have the quiz. And it's pretty cool. I was hesitant to take it. I'm like, oh man, what if I find out that I have porous boundaries or I have rigid boundaries? But honestly, at this stage in my life, mostly it was healthy.
Yay.
And I'm like, wow, all the work that I have done is truly paid off. So I have learned, and through podcasting, because so many people contact me, I had to learn to say no, right? I also learned to, just because something is asked of me and I can do, doesn't mean necessarily that I should extend myself and do. So I've learned like major lessons in my life. And boundaries is not comfortable. It's never easy, right? So I want to talk about the types of boundaries that you identify, 6 types of boundaries, and porous, rigid, healthy boundaries, and just a little description so people can understand and identify themselves with the categories.
Let's start with porous, rigid, and healthy. So, porous boundaries is when we do not have any boundaries, really. It's when we're passive, when we allow things to happen without saying anything, when we pretend to not have a problem with things because we are concerned with keeping the peace instead of being well. Rigid boundaries is like too many boundaries. We have boundaries on everything. They are hard rules. We apply them to all people, all situations. There is no getting in without passing a test of something. And then healthy boundaries is right in the middle. We want to have some sort of structure around how we do things, but that structure should be flexible. We should be able to change our boundaries as we change as humans. We should be able to explore what feels right for us in this particular situation. So being rigid won't help and being passive won't help. With healthy boundaries, you know how to confront situations. You may have some fear or guilt doing it, but you're still able to do it. And that's a really important piece of moving through the boundary process, just trying to get them to this healthier space.
Yeah, even with people who I don't know personally, I still find that it's so uncomfortable to say no. I find it's easier over email. And in the beginning, I used to just copy and paste one standard way of saying no to people because I do know it felt very bad. But now I can just craft a very custom message every time. It took years to get to that point. But there are boundary pushers, right? People who test your limit. And I would love to address that. But I find that even when I'm setting a boundary with someone I don't know, an online person who just contacted me, who wants to be on my podcast, I feel like, oh, why so hard? It's like my heart is sinking a little, my stomach is clenching, right? It's still hard.
Yeah. Boundaries are tough because we're compassionate, we are empathetic, we care about people, we can see that they really want something from us. If you're reading an email, it's probably a really compelling story. And we still need to take care of ourselves. So we can't say yes to everything. You can't have every guest on your podcast. You can't do everything for everyone. And so there are times where even if it is a moving situation, you may still have to say no. And that is really hard when you're a compassionate, caring person because you realize, like, oh, this person really wants this. And so being able to step away from, a request sometimes is just really healthy for you.
Yes. Is that why boundaries are hard? Because we anticipate people's reactions to our boundaries? Are we afraid how we may respond to their reactions? Is that what makes boundaries hard? Or is it because we never learned or our parents didn't teach us boundaries or maybe some other reason? Why do you think this is hard for many people?
It's hard because we have become accustomed to not having our boundaries honored. It's that not that we don't have them, it's that we're rediscovering them and we are rearticulating them. Many of us are born with boundaries. We want to be hugged, we want to be held, we want to be fed. As we grow up, we start to communicate those boundaries. And unfortunately, there are people who will say, no, you cannot have this. It's not okay to want that. You should feel this. Why are you thinking this way? So there are times where even when you have those boundaries, they're not honored. And so it feels like you're in this space of, oh my gosh, I have no boundaries. When in actuality, you have boundaries. And it is a matter of learning to speak those boundaries.
Yeah, I love that you say rediscover them, because in some situations you may have boundaries with your spouse and your children, but maybe in your workplace you may not have such strong boundaries, or you may suffer with your own parents, which is a big topic, but maybe you're good with setting boundaries with your children. So it doesn't mean if you're not good in one area, it doesn't mean you're not good at boundary setting. I think that that's a good message to learn. So can you talk briefly about the 6 types of boundaries?
Yes. You want to name them and I'll just go through them.
Yeah. So physical boundaries.
Yes. So physical boundaries is the space around you. I think in the pandemic, we learned a lot about physical boundaries, right? So this is the space around me. This is how I want to be kept safe and protected. Sometimes that is, not stepping into my physical space. And sometimes it's knowing not to step into another person's physical space. It's how you want to be touched, the proximity to you, the way that people may want to hug or shake your hand. All of those things are your protective areas and boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Sexual boundaries.
Sexual boundaries. Now, this is the one where we have laws in place and sometimes physical too, when you think about like physical abuse. But with sexual, sometimes for some people, those lines are like, I don't know what's appropriate or what's inappropriate. The touching of the back, the touching of the hand, just those subtle things can even be a boundary violation. But certainly things like rape, sexual abuse, assault, molestation, all of those things are certainly boundary violations.
Intellectual boundaries.
Yes, intellectual boundaries is the way that you think about the things in your life. Sometimes we have different political views, our spirituality, the way that we communicate, what's relevant in our lives, our belief system, all of those have to do with our intellect. There are times when we may disagree with people and we could become downright nasty, calling people stupid or dumb, or that's the wrong philosophy to have. If it is not harming anyone, it is certainly a violation of their boundaries.
Emotional boundaries, a big one. How do we avoid people who dump everything emotionally on us? I think this is such a tricky area.
Yeah, emotional boundaries is how you feel. And it is tricky because, as we're communicating with others, we are often in the practice of saying, this is how you should feel, or you shouldn't feel like that, or I would feel like this. That isn't a big enough problem. All of those things can be a violation of someone's right to feel. People may not feel like us. They may not perceive a situation to be, what it is to you, or their process of healing might look different than yours. And it's really important to respect that and not to try to, make people just like you, think like you, be like you. And that can be really challenging because we're sort of used to that in communication and say, hey, this is how you should feel about this situation, even if it's not how the person is actually feeling.
Yeah, here in your book, you have examples of emotional boundary violations. I just want to read a couple of those. Sharing too much too soon, oversharing, sharing inappropriate emotional information with children, emotional dumping. This is like one of my triggers. Pushing someone to share information they aren't comfortable sharing. Oh, I've been on the receiving end, and probably I pushed people too. Invalidating someone's feelings, telling people how to feel, such as you shouldn't be sad about that, and on and on. I think what would be an appropriate response? Of course, responses are very custom and case specific, but if someone is oversharing and you don't want to hear their messages, what would be a short, succinct way of conveying that to them?
Yeah, I think when, someone is oversharing, you can, it's helpful sometimes to transition a conversation to something else like, wow, that sounds like a really healthy topic. And, I'm so happy that you trusted me with that information, but I don't know if I have space to hold it. Perhaps there is someone else, maybe a therapist, maybe another friend who can, help you with that situation. But it feels like too much for me right now. I do want to support you and I want to make sure you get the appropriate help.
Mm. I would just want to highlight something that it's never about them, right? Saying you're too, you're sharing too much. I don't like the way you disclose all your information. It's about us, about protecting our own sanity, our own safety. And that's how we need to communicate. It's never putting down the other person, but I love how it's about us. Boundaries are about us, right?
Absolutely. Yes, boundaries are absolutely about you. And it's so important that you recognize that the boundary is really about how you will show up in a situation.
hmm A simple sentence like this from your book, I don't feel comfortable talking about that topic, I think should be enough. But don't you think people always want to add, I am sorry, and a little justification, a little story? Like recently, I told you in the beginning that I'm really good at boundaries now, but somebody contacted me through all the means that you can contact someone within an hour. And I've just felt so, it was obnoxious. And then it's Friday, 5 p.m., and they booked 15-minute free consultation with me on my schedule through my website. And I'm like, wow, I didn't respond to any of the messages, only to Instagram. And I said no politely, but this person would not take it. It was more aggressive, I would say, the way they approached me. But then I felt compelled to lie, and I did lie. And I didn't feel good about the fact that I lied, but that shut this person down. So I want you to talk about, lying. Why are we going to such extent to over explain ourselves? And is that really necessary?
It feels necessary in that moment to have some level of dishonesty, right? That's why you're doing it because it feels like, oh my gosh, if I'm honest with this person, they could be upset at me. They will be, they may say something in the public about me or, just all of those sorts of things. And I think that lying is a part of what humans do and we do it as a protection in most cases. We're trying to spare the person's feelings or maybe cover up a little something, but it is something that happens. I think the growth is when you find yourself lying less about things, being willing to withstand whatever someone may say about you, not being available and saying no. Part of that is, in your particular situation, I think about this entitlement to access, right? Like there's this sense of, this person is online, they're available through this platform or on this thing, and they have to talk to me. They have to talk to me within, the next hour. I have something so important to say that they need to hear it. And in actuality, that could be true for them and not so true for you. It's like, yeah, a lot of people have important stuff to say, and I'm not available to hear those things either at this time. So we have to remember what we can actually give to others because people have no idea. I think about the way the world moves on when you haven't. Sometimes when you experience death, there is this weird thing that happens where everybody's just getting up, going to work, going to school, cooking dinner, and you're like in the sunken place. And there can be an expectation like, hey, I'm sending you this email. And it's like, not today. So we don't know what space people are in and what they're able to receive. So it's really hard to say like, well, I sent this to you and you have to respond to it. I'm not able to right now. I'm unwilling to. I'm dealing with a cold. I'm dealing with a death. I'm dealing with life and a lot of things are happening and I'm not in a position to receive this information.
Yeah. If you could boil it down, what would be the main healthy ingredients of setting a boundary? And this is what I mean. Like we already said, it's about us. It's never putting down another person. What I mean is about the tone, the language. And I know you're a very compassionate person. So if you could boil it down to how we communicate boundaries, what are main ingredients, what would those be? In your opinion, of course.
I would say be clear, kind, and concise, and follow up and deal with any discomfort that you experience in the process of placing a boundary with another person. Gosh, how do I say this? Sometimes we over explain things. You mentioned earlier the apology that comes before you say something hard, the conversation we like to, antagonize over. And in actuality, what we need to say is very clear. I have had people ask me so many times various things, such as, how do I tell my mother-in-law we don't want to come to her house for Thanksgiving? How do I tell my partner that they steal all the cover from me in the middle of the night? How do I tell my kids they can't go to their friend's party? What you say is very simple. You're already saying what you want to say. You can't go to the party. We don't want to come there for Thanksgiving. Stop taking my cover. Like
it's true. It's true.
It's so clear and right there. But we're looking for the words that will feel the best to the other person. So we're trying not to use words that mean, I don't want to do this. I don't know what those words are, but we're trying to figure out like, what's the nicest way to say this, to say no to someone? It's like, no. I mean, I don't know a nicer way to say, no, I'm not able to do that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think you can throw in a sentence. Let's say if it's your mother-in-law and you don't want to go to their house for Thanksgiving, or you want to celebrate Christmas at your parents as opposed to their parents all the time. I think because we hold resentment and a lot of anger, right? Because we haven't spoken up, we haven't asserted ourselves for many years, let's say, it feels that we have to be either mean or it's going to come across. I think those residual emotions that we hold inside, they come out when we set the boundary all of a sudden. Maybe throw in a kind sentence like you just mentioned before, right? Something, I appreciate celebrating holidays with your family, and it's so nice you always host the gatherings, but this year we decided to do X, right? I think thanking someone or appreciating, maybe just adding an extra layer. What do you think about that kind of approach? if it's too uncomfortable, just to outright say, no, we don't want to come for Christmas, and we don't want to explain. But do you think would that be a good strategy?
Yes, I think if you feel comfortable saying more, certainly do that. I think the challenge is when we're not secure in setting boundaries, we'll say more and then we get upset at this other person for asking questions, for making us think about changing our mind and all of those things, which is something you want to be mindful of when you're not really secure in setting the boundary. There are times where you don't need to say here's an explanation of why I'm doing this. And there are other times where it's okay for you to provide the explanation. It really depends on your comfort level and also sometimes the person you're speaking to.
Hmm. Yeah, going back to the types of boundaries, let's finish them. Otherwise, we can, speak about other topics. Material boundaries.
Yes. So material boundaries is your stuff, your possession, your things, making sure that other people are taking care of them, sometimes not loaning them out, how you want to utilize your money with other people. Those are all really big material boundaries. And in relationships, we have to think about, what we can do with certain people because sometimes it is not the other person, it's us not communicating our expectation that something is returned or on time or in a certain manner. So material boundaries are really important for relationships.
Here is the last one and my favorite, time boundaries. What could you say about time boundaries?
Oh gosh, time boundaries is like the biggest area where we suffer. It's like I don't have time to work out. I don't have time to spend more time with my friends. I don't have time to take a bath. I don't have time to read books. What are we spending our time on? How are we allocating our time? How are we allowing others to use our time? I heard you say earlier with that email where someone just, they emailed you, they DM'd you, they called you, then they hopped on your calendar. Like that is all your time and it should be respected in whatever way that makes sense for you. And that can look like not always being available to people.
Yeah. That was a very unique and unusual case where this person is bombarding me with their stuff. How can I be supportive of your work? How can I just leave me alone? How about that? I already told you no. So I want to talk about boundaries as self-care because that's how I view it, and I'm sure you concur. It's part of self-care, right? If we are doing other things in terms of self-care, one of them has to be boundaries. And the biggest boundaries, as you mentioned, is with ourselves. What do you mean by that? I would love for you to open that up a little bit.
Mm. The biggest boundary is with ourselves. We teach people what we will allow. We certainly set expectations for ourselves. We manage ourselves in the world. Like sometimes we'll say, I told this person, I'm not telling them anything else if they share it with other people and then the other person shares it again. What do? You have the power to not share with them anymore. If they can't honor a boundary, you certainly can honor your own boundary and not give up information that will be shared to others if that's what you want. So there are opportunities for us to really manage the boundary in the situation and not put that on other people.
Mm. When it comes to boundaries, it's not a one and done deal, right? You need to repeat and reset and uphold the boundary. I think that's the hardest part. So I want to ask you this. What is your favorite part of this boundary work? If I were to use that as boundary work, what is your favorite? Is it communicating your boundaries? Do you have a favorite part, or all of this work is your favorite? I'm really curious about that.
Mm. What is my favorite part about boundaries? I think there are so many things that are my favorite. I think teaching people different and new ways to communicate, affirming that they already have the words to say those really hard things. And the real hard part is just saying it. It's not gathering the words, it's actually speaking those words to other people. I think that's my favorite part for sure.
Mm-hmm. Do you recommend someone practice in front of the mirror, or if it's something important? Do you think that's helpful, or is it helpful to just go off the cuff and make your statement or say no to someone?
It is certainly helpful to practice, but I don't want us to be over practice. I don't want us to think about it so much that we sort of forget to say it, or we talk ourselves out of saying it because we are hyper vigilant about how the person might respond or what they might say. So it's really important to not over practice it, to say it, of course, but also not, oh, I have to say this so much, I have to make it perfect, because really you're saying something hard and you don't want it to be over practiced, over rehearsed, and, like this thing that you've worked up to. And it's everything can't be practiced. Some things can, of sure. You may want to think about what to say, but it's not always necessary to have the perfect words, because whatever you need to say, you will get there.
Yeah, good advice. So, how do we identify where or what my boundaries might be, or a person who is listening, they're like, wow, this all sounds great, but how do I know where I struggle or where my boundaries should be or are? Is there an exercise or a question or some advice you would give someone to identify in what area they need to set a boundary?
Follow your feelings. Your feelings let you know where you need boundaries. When are you feeling frustrated, resentful, confused, angry, upset, anxious? Those are all indicators of, is there something that I need to do within myself, or is there something I need to do within this relationship or in this situation? The boundaries will certainly guide you towards what's next.
Mm-hmm. And setting boundaries with people is always going to be hard and difficult. And not always hard and difficult, but it's always going to have maybe some guilt attached to it, or some fear, or some uncomfortable feeling. Is that right? Or those feelings disappear with time?
Do they disappear with time, or do they get easier with time? I think things get easier, and sometimes they do subside and go away. But I don't, I don't think always that has to be the case for you to set a boundary or really honor a boundary. It's, it takes practice and it takes time sometimes. And sometimes it does start to feel better once you have practiced it for a while.
Mm. So if someone wants to up their game in the boundary department, and they have an overbearing mother, they're not setting boundaries with their children, they feel as if their children are taking advantage of them, and they don't have boundaries with their friends, where would you recommend they begin this boundary work? Is there an easy path, or is this very personal? Do you recommend starting with in-laws, for example, or setting limits with your children? What do you think? How do you think about this topic?
I think that you start where you're having the most issues. And it's hard to say what that can be for people. Now, there are tons of people who have questions about in laws. There are tons of people who have questions about work. I would say start in the most stressful place and work your way out. You want to make sure that in other areas you have healthy boundaries, but it's really important to have them in those areas that are impacting your mental health the most.
Mm, yeah. I want to ask you about trauma and boundaries. When we experience trauma in childhood, let's say, how is it affecting our ability to implement boundaries today? Or all boundaries issues are rooted in childhood or trauma. I don't know. How do you think about why someone has porous boundaries and another person doesn't? Is it because of our childhood wounding, or is it because of trauma, or some other reason? But I really want to dig into the trauma and boundaries.
Mm. I think when there has been a history of trauma, of course, there is more of a challenge setting healthy boundaries, whether that be you have become very rigid in the boundaries you have to protect yourself, or you don't feel like you can have any and your boundaries are more porous. But I think the biggest challenge is working with your trauma to figure out what your boundaries are and what boundaries can actually be helpful. There's a book that I really love that focuses on trauma and boundaries, and it's called Where You End and I Begin. And it talks about the emotional, physical, and sexual boundary violations that some people manage. And they talk about just different ways to start to implement boundary when that is the case for you, which is so important because I think it is unique and different because you have been disempowered. And so your voice does need to be a lot stronger, maybe more so in certain situations with certain people.
Mm, yeah. Well, what was the book's title again?
Where You End and I Begin.
Oh, that's a good one. I will put a link in the show notes for that. Let's talk about children and boundaries, setting boundaries with our children. You're a parent too, right?
Yes, I am.
How old are your children?
My kids are 6 and 8.
Oh, very young. I always thought you had somehow you had teenagers for whatever reason. I Okay, so you are setting boundaries with your children. Maybe we can learn a few things from you. Has it always been easy for this boundary expert to set boundaries with her children at home?
No, I think it's still challenging because my kids are growing and developing. And so my boundaries with them are having to change. So it's no, I set this one boundary and this is how it'll always be. It shifts and it mutates into what's needed in that moment. I think that I'm still discovering the boundaries that I need. I'm still figuring out ways to respect their boundaries while having to parent them. I think it's an ongoing process as a parent to navigate boundaries. Some boundaries are really important, and it's, something that they need to be safe. And then there are, other boundaries that are just about respect. And so as a parent, it is really interesting knowing a lot about boundaries and parenting a person and helping them discover their boundaries.
And have you noticed that your children are asserting, because you're setting boundaries with them? I'm sure you're better than an average parent. I mean, I'm just speculating this, but have you noticed that your children are good about their own boundaries because of how you treat them and respect and honor their boundaries?
They are very clear about their boundaries. And sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Right. Because it's like, this is what I want. And this is, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is so true. I have certainly created this scenario where they should be comfortable with these boundaries, but sometimes it comes back and it's like, wow, do we want them to have these boundaries? I'm kidding because I really appreciate it. I think the boundaries that they're able to demonstrate helps me to set boundaries because it's things that I don't even think about. Like one time my daughter, she didn't want to eat something like nuts or something. She said she didn't like them and she was telling someone. And they were like, well, why not? And she was like, do I have to have a reason? And I'm like, you do not have to have a reason. Like, you're teaching me about boundaries right now. Like, you can just dislike stuff and it doesn't matter what the reason is. Like, it doesn't need to be validated by anyone else. So I learned a lot from them, about boundaries.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, we don't want to conform to other or to other people or situations, right? And you're right. Children are very vocal and they do know their boundaries. They may not call it boundaries or boundary work, but they do know when it doesn't feel all right. I think as parents, we do need to attune to that and not force our own agenda or control or cajole or convince them out of their feelings or make them like a certain thing. Or like today, for example, my daughter texted me from school and she says, Mom, and she's 14. She says, Mom, can I get a second ear piercing, because I want to wear some nice earrings? And my first response, Nedra, what do you think my first response would have been? Which I didn't text back, but I wanted to text back.
Yeah, questions. The first response would be more questions. Tell me about this. More questions. I don't know. Maybe it
Yeah,
wasn't immediately no.
Yeah, well, but my immediate response actually was, I want to say no, but I withheld. And since it's over text and not in real conversation, that gave me a little bit of time to pause and think. And I said to her, this is what I texted. I said, that sounds fun. That sounds like a fun idea. Let's talk more and explore, which felt a little awkward because I don't want to explore this. Maybe I should explore with myself. Why am I saying no, right? Because she's very clear on what she wants. And then she said, okay, thanks. Love ya. And I'm like, yeah, I think I was successful. I didn't shut her down right from the beginning, which often we can do.
We have lots of impulsive thoughts, right? Maybe she doesn't even want to follow through with this. She just wants to gauge your interest. I think sometimes with kids, they really want to follow through with stuff when we're like, no, versus allowing them to explore if this is something that they actually want to do or something they're just thinking about. And lots of it is, I'm thinking about this thing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, such great point. And I think if we take it at face value and fight and create a power struggle, they may want to pursue it just to annoy us or in spite of us. Whereas in the first instance, maybe it was just an idea and she never changes her earrings in the first place. She always has one pair of little stud earrings and that's it. And you're so right. I think this is such good advice you just gave. I love that. So with parenting, I mean, I want to help parents with boundary setting. What advice would you give them, or do you need specific examples? I mean, screen time is huge, bedtime is huge, and of course, it's age specific, right? How you set a boundary with a teenager is different than with a 6-year-old. But what advice do you have for parents in setting boundaries with their children?
Yeah, I think that for each type of parenting situation is going to be different, right? Like, there's this general idea of all teens are difficult. That's not necessarily true, right? There are some teenagers who love spending time with their parents. So it really matters about the relationship. I think the biggest gateway to healthy boundaries with your kids is to develop a really healthy relationship with them, no matter what their age is. So really honing in on spending time with them, getting into their world, teaching them, being there for them, and they will feel more comfortable respecting your boundaries. They will feel more comfortable sharing their boundaries with you. And it won't be these, big awkward conversations. It'll just be a part of your process as their parent. I think that for parents is really helpful to figure out, like what you said earlier, why is this even bothering me that she wants this other piercing? figuring out your own stuff could be a really healthy parenting practice, because sometimes we're saying no to stuff just because we couldn't do it. And it might not be anything that you actually care about with your kid or that you see as problematic. We certainly live in a different world. So it's very easy to say, I would have never used a tablet for 6 hours. Well, I don't know. I don't know what I would have done with a tablet. I might have wanted to be on the tablet for 12 hours. So, there are different dynamics, and we really have to honor that. And we really have to think about, what are we trying to prevent or manage, and what are we trying to just not have them do because we weren't able to do it. So that part is really important with kids, thinking about how they feel about stuff. Parents notoriously tell kids, you'll understand when you're older. You don't get it because you're a kid. You don't have any problems. That's not a big deal. All of these different things, when it it's important to remember that they are people too. And although, they don't deal with things in the way that you do, they still deal with things.
Mm, yes, great advice. Setting boundaries with your parents. Let's talk about this. What would you say to a person who is wanting to set the boundary with their mother, for example, who wants to, that let's say the mother is overbearing, they expect certain things, or they make everything about themselves, or what would you say to a person who is hesitant to not offend their mother or break that relationship or not to appear a certain way? Where does that person begin?
Yeah, I think the beginning of that is figuring out what you need and desire in a relationship. I think therapy is a wonderful support here to help you figure out, to give you that esteem to be able to speak your boundaries and your needs to a parent when there has been a relationship of them telling you what to do, that you have to unlearn that they are the only adult in the situation. So I think therapy is a really helpful way to undo some of that. I can't tell my parents anything. They can only tell me stuff type mentality.
And often I find that when adult children set boundaries with their parents, the parents don't take them seriously, right? And they keep violating, and adult children get hurt over and over again. And I've heard millions of times, I'm sure you have too, when someone says, oh, my mom or my dad won't take no for an answer. They never respect my boundary. I've set that boundary before, and they keep violating it. Do you think that's a symptom of the person having not communicating the boundary in an appropriate way? Or is it because the other person is just a difficult person, the parent?
I think that people may not want to listen to you. I sometimes don't want to listen to people. And so when that is the case, guess what? People will certainly try their best not to listen. And it doesn't mean your parent is a terrible person. It just means that they don't want to listen to your boundary. We all do that to some extent, where we want to have our way in a situation. With parents, they are used to being the dominant person in the relationship, and therefore able to tell you what you can or can't do. And what you're trying to do will resurface some of, or refocus what the relationship is. So it's really important to make sure that you're not allowing them to keep you in the child role when you're an adult.
Mm. Nedra, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for spending some time with me and talking about your favorite topic.
You are so welcome. This was absolutely amazing. Thank you for having me.
Oh, feel better. It feels like you have a cold. And thank you so much for doing this. First of all, you could have said no or postponed, but yeah, thank you. Have a lovely week.
Thank you so much. You're welcome.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What's your biggest takeaway? Did you find it useful? How can you apply what you gleaned from this episode into your life? definitely get Nedra's book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace, a guide to reclaiming yourself. It's a super practical book. In fact, the only book you need on boundaries. Let me know if you struggle with boundaries, in what areas of your life, or perhaps you have worked hard to set healthy boundaries in your life. I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you enjoy the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. If you want to join your fellow listeners from around the world and engage in meaningful conversations about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for people like you. Do you love the podcast and find it helpful? Show your support by becoming a patron on patreon.com. Go to patreon.com/authentic parenting to learn more. With a small monthly contribution, you can make a big difference. Join other active members who believe and support the work of authentic parenting. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and elsewhere. And finally, if you want to know what I'm up to in my private life, see behind the scenes of podcasting, get inspiration, and just stay connected, follow me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.